It is midwinter, and the electrical grid has failed. Homes are dark and frozen. There is no lighting, no hot water, no mobile signal. Gasoline pumps no longer flow. Food deliveries to the cities cease. This terrifying scenario is not just science fiction. In today's show, I chat with the author of a peer-reviewed study examining the causes and consequences of catastrophic electricity loss, but importantly, how we might be able to mitigate these risks. Welcome to our listeners and viewers. I am Matt Boyd, and today I'm joined by Dr. Simon Blouin, lead author of a fascinating, I must say, 2024 study examining how prolonged, widespread electricity outages could affect food supply chains. Dr. Blouin, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me. It's really great to have the opportunity to present this research on behalf of my colleagues at the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, also known as ALLFED.
Wonderful. So, Simon, the title of your paper is Assessing the Impact of Catastrophic Electricity Loss on the Food Supply Chain. Now, most of us have probably experienced short power outages, maybe for a few hours or days, but your research has looked at something much more severe. So before we get into the causes of these kinds of scenarios, can you explain just what you mean by catastrophic electricity loss and why it's important to study this?
Sure. So as you were saying, Matt, so most blackouts typically they won't last more than 24 hours, or if they last longer, it will be more like geographically limited. So for example, it will be in an area that was hit by a natural disaster, like an ice storm or hurricane, something like that. And in those cases, even if the blackout lasts many days, maybe a week, maybe a bit more, you can bring outside aid pretty easily because you still have power in other regions of the country that's affected. Here we were interested in something much more severe than that, which we call catastrophic electricity loss, which we loosely define as a blackout that affects at least 5% of the world's population for at least a month. So this is very severe. So 5% of the world's population is roughly the population of the US. So imagine the whole of the United States not having electricity for more than a month. Obviously, something like this has never happened before. It's unprecedented. But the worry there is that if you had a scenario like this, it's very hard to bring external aid. And it's not here in a blackout like this how people could feed themselves, because the modern food supply chain from the farm all the way to your kitchen at home really depends on having electricity. So if you don't have electricity for that long, then the question becomes, how will people be able to feed themselves? So that's why we thought, we need to look into this.
Sure. Yeah. I guess, when I think about electricity, I think about, my lights, my heating, my hot water. But as you sort of allude to, you're talking about a scenario where there's no electrically pumped diesel, no electrical milking of cows, no refrigeration, all these things that could severely impact on food supply. And actually, just to quote from your paper, I pulled out a section here. You've said it is not sufficient to grow food. It must also be processed and distributed. And in fact, history abounds with examples of famines triggered by disruptions occurring beyond the agricultural sector, further along the supply chain. So, yeah, I guess understanding the impact of power failures on these food supply chains seems really critical.
Yep.
So, okay, look, in your paper, you mentioned several scenarios that could actually lead to this sort of catastrophic electricity loss. And you mentioned cyber attacks, you mentioned electromagnetic pulses. Can you just walk us through one or two of the scenarios that you've examined to help viewers and listeners understand what we're talking about here?
Sure. So to be clear, so we think there are different channels that can lead to such a catastrophe. They're all relatively low probability scenarios, but they're not zero probability scenarios. So that's why we think we should think about them and be prepared for them. So the two that we've looked at more specifically, which you just alluded to, so the first one is a coordinated cyber attack. So there the worry is that modern industry, and that includes power plants and the oil infrastructure, all these things we depend for energy, they rely on electronic sensors, controllers, communication networks, and all those things are networked. So in principle, they can be hacked. Um, Even things that are seemingly just mechanical processes, like turning a valve somewhere in a power plant, often they actually depend on electronic sensors or controllers or communication networks. Um, so now and then we hear news stories about critical infrastructure being hacked. But usually it's kind of limited. It's like, oh, it's this facility was hacked or this company. But the worry here is that you could have a more sophisticated coordinated attack where the whole grid is taken out at the same time. And there's a worry that this is becoming more and more feasible with the kind of advanced AI that we have access today, and that's just going to get more powerful in the next months and years. So that's one pathway. So a malicious actor just hacking into the grid and taking out the whole grid. Then the other one is high altitude electromagnetic pulse. So this is a even more severe scenario. We think that's the most damaging one probably. So what is a high altitude electromagnetic pulse? Well, so this is if you explode a nuclear warhead many tens or even hundreds of kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So if you do that, it emits electromagnetic pulses towards the ground, and these pulses will damage or disable electronics and electrical equipment. Um, this is not science fiction. It has been tested in the 1960s by the US and USSR. So we know like that this is a thing. It can be done. But it is unclear what would be the impact of this kind of electromagnetic attack on today's infrastructure because we have so much electronics all over the place. So there's a good chance that we are more at risk of bad consequences from such attack today than we were 60 years ago. So those are the two big scenarios we've looked at.
Right. Yeah. And look, just to be clear, you're not talking in the nuclear attack scenario of an all-out nuclear war. Even this could just be two or three nuclear weapons detonated at high altitude that would have a very wide-ranging impact.
Exactly. So the detonation altitude will set like the radius that's on the ground that's affected, but the radius can be huge. So if someone would detonate a nuclear weapon 500 kilometer above the central US, it would affect essentially most of North America just with one detonation. So
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, for example, I live in New Zealand, which is quite remote, but is still only maybe 1,000 miles from Australia, which does host US military facilities. So if an adversary was to attack Australia, could a hemp attack affect New Zealand?
yeah, in principle it could. It's close enough that it could. And even if it didn't, of course, maybe because it's detonated at a lower altitude to like have a smaller impact zone. But even if it didn't directly hit New Zealand, of course, it would be an indirect effect to New Zealand from trade disruptions
Sure.
and all that.
Yeah.
And maybe just one thing I should clarify is that these electromagnetic pulses have absolutely no effects on human beings or any living beings. So it's only affecting electrical and electronic systems.
Yeah. So nothing like the sort of cancer-causing radiation of a nuclear blast. Yeah.
Yeah.
So look, I mean, these are pretty scary scenarios to think about. You're talking about, potential electricity loss to a whole continent. And to be clear again, we're talking about situations where the electrical systems or their components could actually be destroyed, not merely disrupted. So recovery is not straightforward.
Yeah, so in this cyber attack scenario, yes, this physical destruction is possible. This has been shown. Like there's a famous experiment that's been done where it's been shown that you can hack into a generator and like make it spin in a faster way than it's made to spin, and it can just explode. So yeah, and of course, this is much worse because replacing physical hardware takes more time than fixing a software problem. And in the electromagnetic pulse scenario, there would likely be a mix. So some devices might be okay after a reboot, but there would certainly also be physical destruction. So basically just the electronics being fried out and needed to be replaced.
Right. Okay. Well, those are some scenarios that could potentially cause a catastrophic electricity loss. And what you've actually done in your research is you've developed a computer model to study how these events would impact food supply chains. Can you just explain in simple terms how this model works and what aspects of this food supply chain it considers?
Sure. So the supply chain model that we use is a model that's been used in the past to look at the impact of pandemics on the food supply chain. So we adapted it here to look at the impact of a long-lasting blackout. So there are essentially 5 stages in the supply chain. So you start with the farms, the production sector, and then you have processing, distribution, retail, and finally the consumers. And of course, what we're really interested in here is like how much food the consumers can get after the food goes through all this pipeline. Um, all of these 5 stages, they will operate at a given efficiency that depends on the availability of 5 critical infrastructures or systems. And those systems are the electric grid, of course, fuels, internet or communications, the transportation infrastructure, and the human workforce. And then the way the model works is that we introduce a disruption in the electric grid, and then there's a cascade of effects into all these other infrastructures. So for example, if you have a power loss, then one thing that means is that after some time, the fuel pumps won't work anymore, so you won't be able to refuel your trucks, so your transportation network is disrupted, so that's a problem for transporting food. But also your workforce is disrupted because how are they going to get to work if they cannot put fuel in their cars, and so on and so on. And so each of the steps in the supply chain will be bottlenecked by some of these externalities. And at the end, we look at how much food can we get from the farm to the consumer given those new constraints.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating. So basically, you've taken account of, these five key segments of the food supply chain, five critical systems underpinning the function of those segments, and when you run the model, all these components interact and give you an indication of food supply.
Exactly. Yeah, that's correct.
And so there's technical details, obviously, in the paper, that people can look up. I'll put a link to your paper, obviously, in the show notes. But is this model, is this US specific, or can it be adapted to other locations?
So it can be adapted to other locations. So there are many parameters in the model that, for example, like one big parameter, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about, is like how much food people have at home. Well, this will change from country to country. So in the paper, we did it specifically for the US context, but all those parameters can be adjusted, and the model is open source, so anyone can use it.
Wonderful, yeah. And look, one interesting aspect of your research is actually you used the 2019 Venezuelan blackout as a case study to validate the model. What did you learn from that case study?
Yeah, so maybe first I should explain like the motivation for looking at this Venezuelan blackout. So this model, as you can imagine, has lots of parameters. And some of those parameters, they're not that well constrained. And so there are uncertainties as in any model. So we thought it's important to try to like replicate something that happened in the real world to show that it has some predictive power. Fortunately for the world, there has never been such a catastrophic electricity loss affecting a whole continent for a month. But the closest we could get to that was in 2019. Venezuela lost basically all of its power grid for a week. And we know
Wow.
what happened at that time. We know like the reduction in food deliveries to retailers, how much food had to be thrown out because refrigeration was not working. So we have all these data points, and then we basically ran the model, assuming the same 1 week blackout, and then we have some output, and we compared it to what happened. And we had a pretty good match, so we feel like, okay, like we can probably trust this model to now push it to catastrophes that blackouts that last more than a week. Of course, there's always the caveat that when we test the model with just a 1 week blackout, we don't test the whole model because there are things that in the supply chain that you don't feel after 1 week that you would feel
Right.
after a longer time. So in 1 week, most food doesn't get from the farm all the way to the consumer. It will get, from the distribution center to the consumer or something like that. So you don't test the whole thing, but it's the best we could do with the current data we have.
Sure, sure. And I mean, that's Venezuela. I know last year that Cuba lost power to the whole country as well, at one or two occasions. So nationwide blackouts are not isolated incidents, and that's even before considering the sorts of cyber attacks and EMP attacks and things that you've examined. So your findings basically suggest different outcomes depending on how long the power outage lasts. So let's start looking at those findings. Can you walk us through what happens with food availability in the weeks and then months during some blackout like this?
Yeah, so I think the big picture here is that there are lots of buffers in the supply chain. So initially, things are not too bad. So, for example, most US households have report at least having at least 1 week of food at home. So it means like initially, the citizens of the country that's affected, they don't feel the effects of the blackout too much regarding like the availability of food. And retailers also have some buffer capacity, etc. You have this all the way up the supply chain. But after some time, of course, things start to deteriorate and the supply chain cannot keep up with consumer demand. Now, in the cyber attack scenario that we modeled, we assumed that the blackout lasts about a month. And in that case, at the worst of the crisis, so not during the whole month, but really at the worst point of the crisis, it's something of the order of a 30% reduction in food consumption that we predict from the model. So 30% reduction, that's big, but it's not catastrophic for a rich country. So we in rich countries we already eat more food than we need to. So reducing this number by 30%, you're still above the level that's considered sufficient to maintain basic health. And maybe a good reference point here is like if you take the level of food consumption in the US, you can reduce it by 50% before you reach the level of food consumption per capita in North Korea. So
Oh, wow.
you have some room in there. Now, in the EMP scenario, we think recovery would be much slower because it's not just the grid that would be affected. It's not that like a targeted cyber attack. In this case, it's all industry that's affected indiscriminately. And that means you have like a bootstrap problem because if no industry is functioning, how do you repair the things that are broken? So then in this case, we assume a 1 year recovery time. And in that case, we find that it's possible to have a higher than 50% drop in food consumption. And this is over a quite long period of time. So without proper preparedness, this would mean famine, essentially.
Right. Yes. And I see that you've produced some figures in this paper that show these uncertainty bounds around your central estimates. And when you look at the pessimistic scenario and the when all the worst factors all sort of align, I noted it's sort of potentially even up to 1.5 years or more for full recovery, and food consumption getting down below 40% of what's ordinarily consumed. So yeah, as you say, this is actually a famine, right? And I mean, are people going to die?
Well, I mean, if something like this happen, so there are two things here. So first, this is assuming we're not prepared for this kind of thing. The second thing is we think under those conditions the model is no longer really reliable because it's kind of based on the normal food supply chain. But if you're in such an extreme event that people have barely enough food to survive, then of course the whole fabric of society would be reshaped in
Sure.
some shape or form. So we think when we enter this territory, really what the model is saying is things would be really bad. Don't go there. But we cannot really know what would happen because
Right.
lots of things would be upended.
So in the domains where you are more confident about the results, can you tell us about the sort of factors that appear to play the largest role in determining the severity of the outcomes?
Yeah, so the most important one for sure is just recovery time. How long does it take to get the grid back up? And that, of course, depends on the specific scenario, but also on like how prepared are you for that catastrophe. Then beyond that, for short disruptions lasting up to a month or so. The most important is how much food people have at home. It makes a huge difference if you have 3 days worth of food versus 2 weeks worth of food. For longer disruptions, it becomes less relevant, and then you care more about what's happening further up the supply chain. And really, what matters is how quickly you're able to move from the farm to the consumer.
Right. Yeah. So, what surprised you most about the findings in this research?
Um, it's probably obvious in hindsight, as most things are, but I think what was most significant to me is how what you want to do to prepare for those events really depends on the scenario that you're considering. So there are things that are super useful in some scenarios, like encouraging households to stockpile food at home, and that are completely worthless in other scenarios. Like this stockpile is not useful if you have a 1 year long blackout.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's the key insight.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess kind of probing into that a little bit more. I mean, you've mentioned that in the paper that while a shorter term outage might be manageable, especially if food is able to be distributed equitably, a longer outage could lead to these famine conditions. So apart from perhaps having a bit more food at home, what do you think needs to happen at an individual and at a policy level to better prepare for this sort of scenario?
Yeah, so yeah, individual food stockpile, okay, they're useful for short outages, not so for long ones. So we need more system level solution for long outages. Um, I think there are two important ones that come to mind. So the first one is EMP hardening of the electric grid. So this is something that can be done. So some US electric utilities have already implemented military grade EMP protection at their transmission control centers. So some of their infrastructure should be immune to this kind of EMP attack. So that's obviously a very good thing because then you can avoid like the whole problem before it even starts.
Sure.
Um, it's hard to do this for all industries and all parts of the grids, but at least what you can protect and what's harder to replace. I mean, if you can do it, yeah, that's really great. Then another one would be strategic stockpiles of critical replacement parts. So all these electronic control systems and also high voltage transformers, if you have a warehouse with some backups that are not connected to the grid and therefore they're not really susceptible to those EMPs, well, then if you lose them, you can just replace them instead of having to order new ones from another continent uh, or having to build them. So that will really accelerate the time it takes to get out of this blackout, which, as I've alluded to earlier, is really the thing you care the most about.
Yeah, and I guess communication is going to be a problem when there's a lack of electricity. So even sort of coordinating a response after the fact might be problematic. What sort of
Absolutely.
role might pre-planning or scenario exercises play?
Oh, it's vital. I mean, so all the grid operators, the government, all the other critical industries, the water and like sanitation and hospital. I mean, they need to know like if something like that happens, like what's the plan and like have plans prepared ahead of time so that people know what to do because yes, as you were saying, they won't be able to go on Google and look up like what should I do. So yeah.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned this notion of, the equitable distribution is critical to really ensure that the maximum number of people, get the maximum amount of food that's possible. So we really couldn't allow, panic buying or individual hoarding or things like this.
Yeah, I think this is really a critical thing. So, I mean, if you look at a country like New Zealand, I mean, there's currently probably more than 3,000 calories available per person per day for consumption. And so this means you have a buffer. Like you can lose 1/3 of that and still have enough to maintain basic health for an indefinite amount of time. And this means even in a big catastrophe, even if you lose this third of your food supply, in principle, you can still feed everyone if the food is equitably distributed. So yes, we think it would most likely need something like a World War II style rationing system,
Mm.
where to make sure that food goes where it's needed.
Yeah. I mean, I know my own country, New Zealand, we don't have any sort of national food security strategy or plan. And it sounds like perhaps, it would be useful to have one that considers some of these sorts of scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the cost of developing a strategy like this seems pretty small compared to the potential benefits. And like there's always a tendency to say, ah, it has never happened, so like why worry about it? But I hope like if we've learned something from the COVID pandemic is that sometimes things that have not happened in our lifetime can and do happen. So yeah, better be
For
prepared.
sure. And I also note that the United Nations has just initiated or has a forthcoming scientific study on the effects of nuclear war. And it seems like your research is the sort of thing they should be examining or perhaps even extending.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, so first thing, of course, yeah, and whenever we talk about nuclear war, priority is to avoid it. But it's important to acknowledge that as long as there are nuclear weapons in the world, like it's still a risk. So yeah, that's why this kind of study is super important to know what the effects would be so we can be prepared. So yes, in that context, I think our research is really the sort of thing they should include. In particular, the EMP part, I think there's a clear connection here because in a nuclear war, I mean, you can expect that there's some probability that nuclear weapons would not just be used on the ground, but also detonated to create those EMP pulses. Um, and one thing I would be, interested in seeing more is that, so we've discussed a bit the impact of EMP on the electric grid, but it would also disable all sorts of other critical infrastructures and industries, like, for example, fertilizers. Like we all depend on fertilizer production to live, to produce enough food to feed the world. So if we cannot afford to lose those industries, but in a nuclear war with EMPs, even non-combatant countries could lose those critical industries. So I think that's a really
Yeah.
important issue.
Yeah, such a lot to think about. I mean, for our listeners who might be concerned about these sort of scenarios, is there some sort of constructive takeaway that you like people to take from your research?
Sure. Well, I think the key takeaway is that even though those scenarios are very severe, they're not unsurvivable if we prepare properly. So for short-term blackouts, again, the food stockpile is really useful, and otherwise, we need to push for a system-level solution like MP hardening and having spare parts, some redundancy in the system.
Yeah, great. Look, thank you so much, Sumon, for walking us through this important research. Where can viewers and listeners learn more about your work?
Yeah, well, they can check out the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters, or ALLFED. The website is allfed.info, and we have lots of things there, research about food resilience in global catastrophes. And also, ALLFED is not only doing research, it's also interested in working with governments. So if anyone is interested, please, yeah, do get in touch.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I'll put those links in the show notes. And this discussion has also been a fascinating taste of what's to come on the 26th of February, when my organization, Islands for the Future of Humanity, hosts a webinar and international panel discussion on the topic of catastrophic electricity loss. So see the show notes for more details on that as well. My guest today has been Dr. Simon Blouin. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Matt.